Okay, hey, welcome. We're going to talk about chapter 8 here. Let's get that bad boy going. We're going to talk about the media. And so, like, really, this unit right here, this chapter is really kind of self-explanatory. If you've been kind of paying attention or you pay attention to what is offered to you in society, it's pretty straightforward. So media in itself is just anything that's broadcast or print. And it's made for mass consumption. So anything that goes out, it could be radio, television, streaming services, books, magazines, newspapers, right? And so that's media. And then when we look at mass media, what that is doing is that's just a collection of everything put together. So all forms of media that communicate information to the general public. So media in itself is one of those things. Mass media is the combination of all of those, right? And so journalists and reporters are responsible for uncovering news stories, and they're supposed to keep an eye on the public interest. And then they report that back to you, and that's the media. The realization, though, is that they're starting to become a thin line in some ways between media and public relations. And public relations is a communication that's carried out to improve the image of a company, an organization, or a candidate, right? And so, like, you'll look at the president. President Biden has a press secretary that goes out and gives a press conference to the media, and they ask her questions, and she responds, just like President Trump did, just like President Obama, whoever. And they try to put the most positive spin on that information, going to the reporters as possible. And then the reporters report back on that. And so that's partially, that's media, right? But at the same time, that is really public relations, where they're trying to make something as positive as they possibly can. Businesses will do this a lot. They'll hold public events when they're giving away charitable donations or something like that to try to improve their image throughout. So just be conscious of that when you're watching different things. Okay, so media can be television, it can be broadcast news, it can be cable television. When you look at television programs, you might not. You have scripted, you have unscripted television, reality television. You also have the news, you have sporting events, those types of things. You have broadcast news. Those are going to be your major networks: CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox. You have cable news, and this is cable, and this is going to be everything that you pay for. If you have an antenna, bunny ears antenna that deals with digital signal, you can stream, or you can pick up probably 15, 16 different channels. And those are broadcast, and so those are going to be like your PBSs, your major networks. If you pay for cable television like Cox or AT&T or whatever, that would be considered cable. The book is a little bit behind the times in the fact that it does talk about streaming services, but obviously, like if you subscribe to Hulu Live or Sling TV or one of those are just satellite cable television. So instead of a cable actually coming to your house to connect and to run into your television, they're running through some sort of internet device, and those are still cable television. Okay, so broadcast news or broadcast networks typically have to have some kind of an affiliate. And so these affiliates would be like your local stations, like I'm trying to think, like Cake News, which I think is the CBS affiliate out of Wichita, KAKE, and that would be the affiliate out of Wichita. And let me double check just real quick and make sure that I have their affiliation right. I believe it is CBS, but I could be wrong. Let's love this. It's ABC. So Cake is on ABC. Cake is our ABC affiliate in Wichita. And so Cake agrees with to broadcast the ABC primetime lineup and certain shows at certain times. And then in response to that, the Cake will show their own news typically before and after the national news at a certain set time, like 10 o'clock or whatever time they show their local news. Cable networks typically broadcast from a satellite, and traditionally they would transmit their signal into a local cable hub that would send that signal out to your home through fiber optic cables or whatever kind of cables they run to your house. That's starting to change a little bit, and so it's starting to take away the actual hub, and starting to come in through online servers or whatever, through like Hulu and those types of things. Cable networks, if they do focus on news, are going to tend to focus on more national topics. So you're looking at your CNNs, your Fox Newses, your MSNBCs, those types of things. Look at that. CNN was the first 24 hours news source. It's called the Cable News Network. And networks similar to MSNBC or Fox have followed their suit. Now, one of the problems with the 24-hour news network is the fact that news happens relatively slowly. Like stories build up over time, and you have to do that. And so in order to fill the 24-hour time frame, they've moved away, all these stations have moved away really from straight news into a lot of opinion pieces, a lot of analysis pieces. And when you watch them, obviously, like if you watch them with an open mind, you can obviously tell that there's biases on all the channels. CNN has moved a little bit left in the past 5 or 6 years. MSNBC's always been pretty far left. Fox has always been far right. And you can pick up those biases. Sites like the BBC that operate outside the United States, I'm going to sneeze, I'm sorry. Sites like these typically focus on world events. The BBC inside England would have a different broadcast than the BBC that is broadcast to your television or your radio, right? The popularity of online and the fact the internet and the fact that people go online to get their news now, and the fact that people are 100% connected to the internet basically at all times, has really diminished the quality and professionalism of news reporting. News organizations typically don't have the time or the money to devote to making sure that all their stories are correct at all the time. And there's this big race to be the first one out. And so it results in a lot more mistakes being made in the media, and media going back and apologizing for things that they do. And you can notice that, like when I was a kid, now granted, maybe I wasn't paying attention, but I don't ever really remember there being a typo. I'm sure there were typos or misspellings or whatever in media, but now when I read stuff online, I constantly find things. And now maybe that's because I'm looking for them now and not when I was 18 or 22 or 6 or whatever. But we have that. Social media has also brought about change. The fact that young people typically don't sit down to get their news from the evening news. Like when I was a kid, my family, we would always watch the 5:30 news. The 5:30 news would be on, and then the 6 o'clock news would be on. So there would be an hour of the day that's where you would get your news. Today, you have so many different news choices. You can get news from CNN or MSNBC or Fox 24 hours a day. You can get on Facebook or Instagram, and you can get people's opinions constantly. You can go to YouTube and catch those snippets of news. And so young people and even old people are going to get their news from different sources or from newer sources. Or typically, one of the problems that we're seeing in media today is this idea of confirmation bias that the book, I was a little disappointed that the book didn't talk about, is the fact that, you seek out sources that try to confirm what you already believe. And so if you lean towards the left, you're going to be more drawn towards MSNBC, or if you're lean more towards the right, you're going to be more drawn to Fox News or Breitbart or one of those news organizations because they're going to confirm what you already believe. One of the major problems with news media today is the fact that the federal government's taken away some anti-monopoly bills, and they allow conglomerates to own as many news sources and radio stations as they'd like. And so right now, all the major media outlets are owned by one of 6 conglomerates. So really, there's 6 companies that own all of your news sources in the United States. And that's really going to put a limit on checks and balances, what can be presented, what can't be, and you can really craft if those 6 news sources work together, they can really craft a story that might not exist, or they can control stories from going out that they don't want out, so they can really control information. One of the things to keep in mind when you're being a consumer of media or the news is the fact that regardless of if you're watching TV or reading the newspaper or listening to the radio, all of those things are a business. Even books, everything is a business, and it's there to make money. And so you get, how you make money is through advertising. How you get advertising is you get viewers, and so you give the people what they want, or you create some type of relationship with the public in order to better your business. Okay. The basic model is to attract more viewers and make more advertising money. The book refers to the media as the fourth estate. That would be referring back to the French Revolution, in which the first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, the third estate was the common people, everybody else, and then the fourth estate would be some kind of organization that's working to keep the other 3 estates in line. I don't know. I think that's probably true to some extent, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of bias, and we'll talk about bias that goes into it. One of the goals of media is to set agendas. They choose which issues and topics deserve public attention. Again, 24-hour news is not going to make it if you just have a guy sitting there, or a gal sitting there in front of the camera, just talking about, just informing you what's happened, like so-and-so did this and so-and-so did this. You really need to bring out analysis and discuss these topics in meaningful ways that people are going to relate to. And so the public is going to respond to different news stories. And when they do respond to those news stories, typically you're going to get more news stories. When President Obama was president, CNN did not just devote 24 hours a day to his every action. But when President Trump became president, CNN really focused on the presidency and the actions of President Trump. Fox News, on the other hand, when President Obama was president, focused a lot on his actions and what he did. And so, that was what their viewers wanted. They were tuning in to get an opinion, probably a negative opinion on their leader that they didn't necessarily care for. And so that was the place to go and to get that. And so it sets that agenda because the public is responding to that news or responding to that information. They're coming back to get it time and time again. And so the media is going to feed those stories. Examples would be like the war in Ukraine. Obviously, that's a main headline story, and it's an important story. It's one, but if nobody was tuning into it, the media would go away from it. There's, probably 30 wars going on right now across the world, where there's combat going on in other places across the world, but the Ukraine is the one that is getting the attention. The Rodney King story. The book talks about the fact that it was recorded by a camcorder, goes on public access, and then the news picks it up, and the public responds to that, and that's why Rodney King became a huge story in the early 90s. Ethiopia, the famine in Ethiopia, had been going on for a long period of time until the news picked it up, and then the public reacted to that, and they wanted more stories and information about that. So another goal of media is to promote the public good by offering a platform of public debate. And so when you watch news sources, a lot of times you'll get a pro side and an anti side, and the anchor is supposed to kind of be in the middle. I think over time that's kind of faded out, where you typically have whatever side of the story that the media organization is trying to present. They bring more of people that support that idea onto their show. Local news tends to inform people on what's going on in their towns and their societies versus national news, larger pictures. We've already kind of chatted about that. Media's job is to prevent news. It's supposed to be to present news in unbiased fashion. Um, I I think that's very difficult to do. I think every time that you're presenting something and you have something on the line, such as money or livelihood or advertising, you're going to have some kind of bias. So the best that we really can do as consumers of media is to try to identify that bias and see what's coming in. You know, if you look at Hannity or Hannity on Fox News or Anderson Cooper, um, you know, a lot of, well, I'm going to pick on Fox News just for a second, because at one time, Fox News actually had to run a small banner underneath some of their primetime news shows that said this is an opinion piece or this is not news, because they were so biased to one side, and they took things so far out of proportion that was a legality that they had to undertake to avoid legal repercussions. CNN with Anderson Cooper, like 360 with Anderson Cooper or whatever, I think is more of the traditional news source. But again, I think it's very biased towards one set of political beliefs, and that's because of advertising. Hannity's the same way. Hannity's going to be very right wing. He's going to present stories that only focus on the things that he wants to talk about on his show or his viewers want to see. And so you have that editorial and analysis of issues, and they just run the advertising. I think one interesting thing about this is you know, as you guys are younger, and I don't know how many of you are actually watching this, because I can kind of track my views on for my YouTube videos, and I know that's not very many, but I know that you know, as you guys are consumers of media in our streaming services, and the way that we get our information has sped up quite a bit. And so like you watch a television series on Netflix, you might not watch it live, but you go back and you don't have any commercials. You watch something like on Hulu, and again, you can choose to get rid of the commercials. I think that the old format of broadcast television or broadcast news is probably within the next 10 to 20 years is going to go away, because the attention spans of the American public are just not, just the public in general, are just not going to be there for commercials. If you watch Fox News, those snippets, so those little pieces are really, really short. Like you know, it might be 2 or 3 minutes, and then go to a minute or two of commercials, and then come back for a brief period, and then go back to a commercial. Now, one reason they do that is they have a large advertising budget. They have lots of people wanting to advertise on their shows. The second is just to maintain viewership. They have a very older viewership that ties into that, right? Versus the younger generation, I don't think would put up with the amount of commercials, especially like as you know, TikTok and those things, those types of videos start to become more and more popular. Our attention span is very, very short. And so if you don't get in within 10, 15 seconds, you're out. Print media has a long history in the United States. The book talks about the Stamp Act of 1765, in which the cost of paper and printing materials went up, and the newspapers wrote against the Stamp Act in a very negative light, and was one of the inspirations for the American Revolution. Following the Revolution, we have an era called the Party Press era, in which basically newspapers fill this void of CNN versus Fox News, or MSNBC versus Fox News, and the fact that newspapers would pick a political side, and then they would cover those stories through access to those politicians or those people that believed in certain ways. Now, political parties at that point would actually pay those newspapers certain amounts of money to cover those stories. I don't think that necessarily happens today with the news media, but you do see this type of thing with access. Like if you're a if you're a left-leaning, I don't know, if you're a middle of the road Democrat, right? Typically, you can get yourself on CNN pretty easily. On if if you're a senator, Republican, or whatever. If you're a conservative Republican, you can definitely get on NBC or on Fox News pretty easily. And so that ability for access and information leads to programming and bias in presenting materials. From 1830 to 1860, there's some developments in printing that allows for cheaper and faster production of newspapers and printing of newspapers. And so the topic moves away from political discussion and into kind of social gossip of the day, and people would eat that up. And so in 1840, you start to see reporters kind of refocus themselves, I guess, and you start to see the creation of serious journalists, people that focus on real stories, and then you have the gossip sections as well. So you have two things that are working against each other, not necessarily working against each other, but just two different forms of media. They all might be in the same newspaper, but they're different ideas. So you have like your real, quote unquote, real news, and then you have your gossip over here. Muckraking during the late 1800s was a popular form of journalism in which social reform was brought to the forefront, in which reporters or journalists were tasked with exposing corruption in politics and business and just the underbelly of urban life. Jacob Riis, I think I misspelled his name. I think it's R-I-I-S. Jacob Riis was a photojournalist, went out and took pictures of immigrant families living in tenements. Upton Sinclair writes the book The Jungle, which was actually supposed to focus on immigrant life in America, but he wrote so well about the scenes from the meatpacking plants that he actually institutes political reform and was instrumental in passing the Pure Food and Drug Act because of public outcry because of that. Okay. The book talks about in recent years, there's been a decrease in investigative journalism. I think one reason for that is the fact that investigative journalism costs so much money and it takes so much time that journalists and major news organizations don't want to make those types of investments. But it's troublesome because without investigative journalism, there's nobody really trying to keep the government in check, keep politicians in check, doing those types of things. Now, I think if a major scandal would break and it would become profitable to sponsor investigative journalism again, you would see that come back. Radio. Let's talk about radio for a second. Radio is really not something that you necessarily think of today as a form of entertainment, maybe outside of your car. But radios for a long period of time were people's televisions. It was the first form of mass media that was brought into the home outside of, I guess, newspapers. So it would be the next one. And you would have weekly broadcast shows that would come out in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, like dramas or comedies. And just like you would tune in to watch This Is Us on NBC, you would tune in to listen to the Otis and Andy show or whatever, right? Almost as soon as radios became very popular in the 1920s, presidents began to make speeches on the radio. Warren Harding is the first one to make regular speeches, and he would give regular speaches to his people. Presidents still do that today. They're not covered nearly as much as the televised speeches. Franklin Roosevelt is the president probably uses the radio the best. He does that during the Depression. He would hold a Sunday night fireside chat, not every week, but regularly, and talk to people like kind of like a loving grandfather, like telling people how the banking system works and why we need banking reform and those types of things. And so Roosevelt kind of wins over the people with that. When World War II starts to break out, the demand for news and more frequent updates becomes important, I guess, for radio. And so radios start to focus more of their attention on the news. Newspapers can only print, maybe twice a day if they're lucky, right? And so the news, excuse me. So the newspaper can only print twice a day, and so they're slow compared to the stories that could break on radio. That could break minute by minute, hour by hour, and so people start to rely on news from the radio more frequently. One of the first stars of this time is Edward Murrow, who hosts a radio show, weekly radio show called Hear It Now, and he would report from Europe during the early days of World War II. And focus on, like, you know, the early happenings of the German invasion of Poland and whatnot, right? And then Murrow is going to transition to TV following the war, and he's going to be one of the reasons that people start to transition from radio to television. Okay. TV becomes popular in America after the Second World War, just like radio becomes wildly popular in America after the First World War. Roosevelt's speech was the first official broadcast of in the United States, television broadcast, and that's in 1939. It's not until after the Second World War in the 1950s that most people can start to afford homes or televisions in homes. And televisions are really going to change the relationship between individuals and their politicians. People can watch body language. They get a better idea of image. They can see what that person looks like and would they like them in real life or not, versus like just reading about them, right? An example of this would be the 1960 presidential debate between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. I think we've already talked about this, in which Nixon is struck with the flu right before the debate, and he refuses makeup. And so he looks kind of like I do. He looks all shiny, looks sweaty, uncomfortable during the debate, where Kennedy had been out in California. He's all tan and bronzed, makeuped up, and he looks just fantastic. And the people that watched on television respond much more positively to Kennedy than Nixon, versus the people that listened to it on the radio believe that Nixon won the debate. In 1952, Nixon actually gives a he was a vice president for Dwight Eisenhower in 1952, and he had a political scandal in which he was accused of using political funds inappropriately. And he gave a speech. It gave like a television interview with him and his family, where he was talking about, you know, how all these things about politics and whatever, and like he never uses money or accepts inappropriate gifts. And then at the end of it, it's Nixon and his girls and his wife, and he's like, oh, I actually did accept one inappropriate gift. It's this Cocker Spaniel named Checkers, and so it was the family dog. And of course, the family dog runs into the scene, and you see Nixon and his kids and his wife, and, you know, they're all petting the dog, loving the dog, and it makes Nixon an approachable, likable guy as a vice president. Nixon also uses television and media in the Cold War when he goes to Moscow, and he meets Premier Khrushchev, and they have their kitchen debates, and they do that. So really from 1960 to 1990, this is going to be considered the golden era of presidential TV. Really until 1990, there was cable television before that, but like there's not a ton of channels. Maybe you have 15, 20, right? There's still a lot of people that only in 1990 that only have 3 or 4 channels. And so when the president would come on, like tonight, President Biden is going to give us a State of the Union address, so you can date this video if you want to know that. But like he's going to give us President State of the Union address, and if you only had network television, that's all you would see, because on PBS you have Biden, on ABC you have Biden, CBS, Fox, the networks, you have Biden, you know, right? But with cable television and with streaming services, if you don't want to watch that, I mean, you can watch Octonauts, or you can watch We Bare Bears, or you can watch, you know, reruns of The Golden Girls, or whatever you want to watch. And so the president has lost some of his ability to communicate with the people. From 1960 to 1990, it was almost like he had a monopoly on television when the president would speak. And it was a big deal when the president would make a presidential address, right? He was on 80 to 90% of the channels. And the president could really go out and he could influence the belief of a nation, because not only could he dominate television for one night, he would not have to face the scrutiny of cable networks that were opposed to his point of view. And so, like, you know, when President Reagan would go on TV, let's say in 1982, and he would give a speech, he wouldn't have to face, you know, CNN or MSNBC picking apart his speech for the next 18 hours. CBS might have a short thing where Dan Rather would talk about, you know, the president and did he address this well? Did he address this? But, you know, most people, you know, you watch that and then it kind of goes in one ear and out the other, and then you're on to, you know, Hill Street Blues or whatever. So during that time frame, the president really had a lot of power in television. We talked about that. Modern day candidates can start to use social media and YouTube, and they can start to craft their message. You know, President Trump was very effective in using Twitter and putting out short little blurbs about what he wanted, what he wanted to talk about, or what he wanted the media to focus on. Obama was pretty successful with Facebook in 2008. Now, you know, by this time, I think to reach the young voter, you're going to have to get onto other avenues. But like, I think that's probably where politics are going. Like, you got to figure out where the 18 to 24-year-old voter is, what they care about, and how can you reach them in a reliable, meaningful message on social media or on their phones, or meet them where they are, right? We also see in this era of citizen journalism, in which everybody has a microphone, everybody has a camera with them basically all the time, and they can record candidates in kind of gotcha moments, right? The Donald Trump Billy Bush tape, where the Access Hollywood tape, where he was talking to Billy Bush inside the trailer. Was it for Inside Edition? I think it was Inside Edition, and he was talking about the things that he did to women. Or, you know, Obama was caught off guard, basically making a derogatory statement about people in the Midwest clinging to gods and guns. Or Mitt Romney was at a bar having some drinks, and he was talking to somebody about how 40% of the people would always vote Democrat because they were dependent on welfare. And so these are things that, you know, a politician from the 1950s might have said, or the 1930s might have said, but they wouldn't have, and they might have been reported or talked about, but they necessarily wouldn't have had, you know, viral status where those videos go out and everybody sees them and listens to them. You also see a situation in today's world where non-news sources can start to shape opinions. Sitcoms. People don't necessarily watch sitcoms like they used to, but like when you would watch a sitcom on a regular basis, those people become important to you. Those characters almost become like family members. So on Thursday night, you would sit down and watch Seinfeld, and Jerry and Elaine and George and Kramer, they became like, you know, like your family on Thursday nights. And so like if they would say something with a political point of view, well, then maybe it starts to seep into your mind, and you trust those people, you trust those characters. And so then you start to side with them. One of my political theories is that Norm Macdonald and his Bob Dole impersonation really hurt Bob Dole in the presidential elections of what would be 1996. I don't think Bob Dole had much of a chance of beating Clinton at that point, but Norm Macdonald's impersonation of Bob Dole was pretty spot on, and it was pretty damaging. If you were watching that, like, you know, you watch Saturday Night Live, and it was a pretty popular show back in the day during that time frame, and it did some political damage. Talk shows, it's pretty common for politicians, especially high level politicians, to make the talk show circuit. You know, I'm trying to think, 2016. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton all were on, you know, the late night talk shows, trying to drum up support for their candidacy. The book talks a lot about the Daily Show, which was on Comedy Central. It was like it started off as kind of a spoof news story, kind of like a weekend update from Saturday Night Live, and then it kind of turned into a legitimate news source. Like it wasn't breaking stories, and it was always trying to put a comedic spin on stories, but it was reporting on stories. And so young people would go there and get their news. I think one of their taglines was where more people get their news than should. The media and the First Amendment, we have the media is protected obviously by the First Amendment. We have freedom of press, right? And without this freedom of press, the government could shut down media sources that they don't agree with or that they don't like. You could look at the situation in Ukraine right now, where the President Putin arrested or took off the air Russia's most popular night show host because he spoke out against the war. And so there you go. There's freedom of press. There are some limits. You have slander and libel laws. Slander is speaking false information, so making a speech about somebody with intent to harm them. Libel is printing false information. And there's a couple things that there's a couple criteria that have to be proven to hold a media source to slander and libel laws. It's very difficult. You have to prove that the statement was made as a fact and not as an opinion. So like, again, Fox News putting labels on some of their opinion shows that this is an opinion and not a news show. It's up to the defendant to bring the suit. So like, you have to bring, if you feel like you've been wronged, you have to go out and do it yourself. And you must, you must show that the media source acted in a reckless manner. So you can read about New York Times versus Sullivan, where a police chief from Alabama sued over an inaccurate statement, but the New York Times was originally exonerated of that. Probably one of the bigger stories recently was with Sarah Palin in the New York Times. She sued the New York Times for, I believe, defamation of character based on one of their editorials. And that case didn't. Basically, she didn't prove her point in case. Didn't prove her case in court, and the case was dismissed. Newspapers can print classified information. Typically, if they're given information by if they're given that information or they witness it, like if a reporter witnesses some kind of top secret or operation or something, they can report on it. Typically, before that happens, the story will be given to the government for them to make a comment on. And if it's so damning of information, like it would put American lives in jeopardy or whatever, the government might ask for a delay in the publication of that information, or might ask for the newspaper or the media outlet not to publish it. It's very difficult for the government to prevent somebody from publishing information like that ahead of time. This is called prior restraint. The Supreme Court typically rules that the government cannot impose prior restraint unless there is some sort of outstanding circumstances, like you're going to put American troops in danger. You're going to put American lives in danger, and then at that point they could stop or slow down the printing. Like, I don't know, let's say like you had a special forces operation that was intact, and you and the news source found out ahead of time, and they published that SEAL Team 6 was going after Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, Islamabad, Pakistan. And they published that beforehand, before they were told, or before the media was allowed to. That could have put the Special Forces members, put their lives in danger. Okay, the Federal Communications Commission was actually put in place in 1934. There's a 5-member board that oversees radio and television. Basically, they ensure that the radio stations and television stations apply for a license. They follow the rules. They provide some sort of public forum for discussion. They serve minority and local communities. They limit advertising. And there are certain things that local stations have to do. They have to operate equal time. This is called the equal time rule, where if a station gives time to one candidate, they also must give an equal amount of time to the opposition or an opposing candidate. Or if they sell advertising space to one of those candidates, they have to sell advertising space to the other one at the same rate. Now, if it's a purely news story and the government and the news is covering a candidate, they don't have to cover each candidate equally, but if they're selling time, they do. The FCC also oversees indecency regulations, and this was laid out in Miller versus California and the Miller test, and you guys can kind of read that there, but it lays out like, you know, what is obscene and what is not obscene. Now, broadcast television is under the thumb of the FCC. Cable television actually isn't, or it is to a lesser extent, but cable can actually choose to show nudity or use profanity in less restrictive ways than broadcast television can. Okay, and this is typical because children could stumble onto a radio station and hear, I don't know, George Carlin's 7 Dirty Words comedy sketch, versus you know, if you have it in your home. And the kid goes and finds it and puts it on the record player, the CD or whatever, right? That child or you are choosing to listen to it versus, you know, a kid just flipping through the channels and he runs into, you know, a graphic lovemaking scene on a movie. And so between the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m., the FCC is a little bit more strict. After 10, from between 10 and 6, there's less standards. Cable companies are not held to these strict standards, but many comply. We already kind of talked about that. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 changed the number of radio stations that a company could own. Before 1996, you could only own 40 radio stations and 12 television stations. Now those are totally unlimited. One of the things that you can definitely tell is if you drive across the country, the radio stations don't change. You know, they're iHeartRadio and Clear Channel and those mega radio corporations control large amounts of airspace. The media can gather some of its information from the Freedom of Information Act. This was put out in 1966, in which the executive branch, and now most organizations or cities have some sort of a Freedom of Information Act, in which citizens can request documents, and this is supposed to increase openness between the people and the government. President Reagan exempted the CIA and the FBI from these laws. Journalists have to be accredited if they're going to follow the White House or report on the military, and that keeps spies and all kinds of different people out. One of the ways that the White House and the military can regulate with the information that gets out is that you can take away somebody's accreditation. If you remember, President Trump took away somebody, I forget the reporter's name. I don't remember if it was Jake Trapper or Jim Acosta. They took away their accreditation from the White House newsroom, and that caused a big stink. Reporters have something known as reporter's privilege, and where reporters protect their sources. Examples of that might be like Watergate, and where the executive director of the FBI, his name was Mark Felt, was protected. He was given a code name called Deep Throat by Woodward and Bernstein that broke these stories for the Washington Post, and they never had to give up their informant. And these types of relationships are going to lead to positive relationships between whistleblowers like Mark Felt or Edward Snowden in the press. If you have a story that needs to be brought to light, the press can protect your identity, I guess, or your secrethood or whatever. However, the press, the Supreme Court ruled that the freedom of press didn't extend to confidentiality of sources, although a lot of times the reporters will go to jail rather than reveal their sources. They'll stand in contempt of court and those types of things. Have a bunch of different types of bias that's important to kind of understand. You have hypodermic theory, which argues that people have a very limited worldview. Like, we don't get outside of our little bubble very often. And so the media can just inject statements into our mind and we just readily believe them. There's other people that argue that media has really minimal effect. The minimal effect theory says that people listen to their friends and their coworkers a lot more than those people that they disagree with. And so if the media doesn't confirm what they already believe, then they're probably not going to listen to it. You have cultivation theory, in which the media develops a person's point of view of the world by presenting their perceived reality. One thing that you do notice once you start to look at media through the eyes of bias is framing, in which framing the media might present pictures. If you want to talk about like the economy, and let's say CNN wants to showcase the economy doing well under President Obama or President Biden. You might show like the stock market being up, or people in new cars or whatever. And Fox News is trying to show that the economy is poor, and so like you would have panhandlers or unemployment lines or whatever. And both of these images can actually be true, and they can be happening at the same time. It's just how you're framing that story. You could be talking about job numbers or whatever, but if you could be given the same information, but you're showing images, conflicting images. Or images that conflict each other to help you frame your story, to plant seeds in people's minds. And so you have episodic framing, in which you focus on specific details, and then thematic framing, in which you look at the broad picture. And typically, you would pick one of those if the details support your story better than the broad picture. Well, then you're going to focus on that. But if the overall broad picture of something fits your story or your point of view better, that's what you're going to focus on. Priming, you might run. Let's say you want to do a news story that shows how bad the economy is, or you want your viewers to believe that the economy is very poor. You might do a story about unemployment, whether it's going up or down. Go talk to unemployed people right before you do a story over the economy. And so like you watch the news and all unemployed person, and then we'll be right back to talk about the economy. And then you're like, oh, hey, you know what? All these people are unemployed. The economy must be crap. And so that's framing. They go on to talk a little bit about political choices and why people run for political office and those types of things, and how the media typically responds to those. The last section of the book, I'm going to let you read on your own. But that's where we are with chapter 8. There'll be a quiz up shortly, and I hope everybody has a great day. I will see you with chapter 9 before too long. Bye.